There are moments in life that split your timeline into two. Before and after, mine happened on a Tuesday morning. In a marble hallway, 30 seconds before the most important board presentation of the year. Her name was Barbara Ellison, executive director, 41 years old. The kind of woman who walked into a room and rearranged the air. She didn't raise her voice to command respect. She simply existed at a frequency that made everyone around her stand a little straighter. I had worked under her for 18 months. 18 months of clipped emails, precise instructions, and a gaze that could freeze a boardroom mid-sentence. I knew my place. I kept my head down. I did my work. That was the deal. But that Tuesday morning, she turned too quickly on the polished floor. Her heel caught the edge of the runner mat, and I watched her begin to fall in what felt like slow motion. I moved without thinking. My arm caught her waist. Her hand gripped my sleeve. Her face, for one unguarded fraction of a second, showed something I had never seen from her before, surprise. And then, barely above a whisper, I heard myself say, "Careful, baby." The hallway did not go loud. It went quiet. That specific kind of quiet that has weight to it. The kind where you can hear your own heartbeat answering for what your mouth just said. Two junior associates froze mid-step near the elevator. Margaret from legal held her coffee cup halfway to her lips and simply stopped. And Barbara straightened slowly. Her hand released my sleeve with the kind of deliberate calm that told me every single nerve in her body was fully operational and making decisions. She looked at me, not the sharp, evaluating look she gave quarterly reports, not the cold, dismissive glance she offered people who wasted her time. This was something else entirely. Something I didn't have a word for yet. Something that sat directly between dangerous and curious. 3 full seconds passed. I know because I counted them the way a man counts seconds when he's fairly certain his career is ending in real time. Everyone. Her voice was composed. Effortless. "Give us the room." It wasn't the hallway, you can't give someone a hallway. But those two associates and Margaret from legal understood perfectly well what she meant. Because within 30 seconds, the corridor was empty, and the only sound was the distant hum of the elevator descending. She turned back to me. "My office," she said. Now, I had been in Barbara's office exactly 4 times in 18 months. Each visit had been transactional, efficient, in and out in under 7 minutes. I knew this because I had unconsciously timed them. The way you time things when a room makes you slightly nervous and counting feels like control. This time, she closed the door herself. She didn't sit behind her desk immediately. Instead, she moved to the window, floor to ceiling, overlooking the steel and glass geometry of the city below, and stood with her back to me for a moment. Her posture was immaculate as always, but there was something in the set of her shoulders, a tension that wasn't entirely professional. When she turned around, her expression was unreadable in the way that only truly intelligent people can manage. Completely composed on the surface, completely alive underneath. "Tell me something, David." She said my name like it was a word she was testing the weight of. Was that reflexive or intentional? I opened my mouth, closed it. The honest answer was reflexive. Completely, embarrassingly reflexive. The kind of thing that bypasses your brain entirely and comes straight from somewhere more instinctive and far less professional. But standing in her office, with the city light falling across her face and her eyes waiting on my answer with that calm, unblinking patience, I found that the honest answer felt surprisingly difficult to deliver. "Reflexive," I finally said. She held my gaze for a long moment. "Interesting," she said quietly, almost to herself. Then she moved to her desk, sat down, folded her hands precisely on the surface, and looked at me the way she looked at complicated problems she intended to solve. "Here is what happens next," she said. "That moment in the hallway does not exist. Not in conversation, not in speculation, not in whatever story Margaret from legal is currently constructing in her imagination." A pause. "Are we clear?" "We're clear," I said. She nodded once, reached for a file, signaled, without looking up, that I was dismissed. I was almost at the door when her voice stopped me. "David." I turned. She was looking at the file, not at me. Her pen was moving across the page, professional, controlled. Every inch the executive director, but the corner of her mouth, just barely, carried the ghost of something that might, under different circumstances, have been a smile. "Close the door on your way out." Something changed after that Tuesday, not dramatically. not in the way that makes for clean, obvious stories. It was quieter than that, the kind of change you only notice in retrospect. When you look back and realize the ground beneath you had been shifting for weeks before you felt it move. It started with the late nights. Our company was 3 weeks out from a major acquisition deal, the kind that gets written about in financial publications and discussed in hushed, reverent tones by people who measure success in balance sheets. Barbara was leading the charge, as she always did. Relentless, precise, operating on what appeared to be a combination of black coffee and sheer force of will. I was assigned to her core team, which meant that when the building emptied at 6, 7, 8 o'clock, I was still at my desk. And so was she. The first evening it happened, I was in the conference room assembling revised projection figures when she appeared in the doorway. No jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbow, reading glasses pushed up into her dark hair like she'd forgotten they were there. She looked, and I say this with full awareness of what it cost me to admit it, completely, devastatingly human. "The Henderson numbers are off," she said, dropping a file on the table beside me. "Third column, find it." "No, please. No, when you get a chance." Classic Barbara. I looked at the column, found the error in 40 seconds. "There," I said, circling it. "Decimal placement. Whoever ran this was working too fast." She leaned over the table to look, and she was close enough that I could catch the faint trace of her perfume underneath the coffee and the long day. Something warm. Something that had absolutely no business being as distracting as it was. She straightened, looked at me sideways. "You're faster than the last analyst I had." "Is that a compliment?" I asked, because it almost sounded like one. She picked up the file. "Don't push it, David." But there it was again, that barely there thing at the corner of her mouth. By the second week, it had developed its own rhythm. She would appear, drop something impossible on the table. I would solve it, or push back on it, or occasionally ask a question that made her stop and actually think, which I slowly learned was the highest form of currency in Barbara Ellison's world. She didn't respect agreement. She respected challenge. So I challenged her, carefully, strategically, with the particular kind of nerve that only develops when you're sleep-deprived and running on vending machine coffee at 10:30 at night. "You know," I said one evening, leaning back in my chair while she reviewed the amended proposal, "most directors would have delegated half of this by now." She didn't look up. "Most directors would have also missed the liability clause on page 47. Did you catch it? 2 hours ago." She turned a page. "Did you?" I had, but barely. And 40 minutes after her, apparently. "You're insufferable," I said. She looked up then, full eye contact, and the expression on her face was something I was beginning to recognize. The specific look she wore when something genuinely amused her, but her instinct was to contain it. "And yet," she said evenly, "here you are, still in the building at 10:45. "Here I am," I agreed. A beat of silence settled between us, but it was a different kind of silence than the one in the hallway. That one had been tense, uncertain, loaded with consequence. This one was almost comfortable. She looked back at her papers. I looked back at mine, but the distance between us felt somehow smaller than it had been an hour ago, and neither of us moved to correct it. It was a Thursday night when the professional boundary between us quietly, almost imperceptibly, dissolved. Not because either of us planned it. Not because we made a decision or crossed a line with intention. It happened the way most real things happen. Gradually, and then all at once. We had been working for 6 straight hours on the acquisition presentation. The office was empty. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had shifted from amber dusk to the deep blue geometry of a skyline at midnight. Someone had left a half-full pot of coffee in the break room, and we had divided it between us without discussion, the way people do when they've spent enough consecutive hours together to develop small, unspoken systems. Barbara was at the whiteboard, marker in hand, breaking down the stakeholder risk analysis with the kind of focused intensity that I had long since stopped finding intimidating and started finding quietly, reluctantly, magnetic. And then she stopped. Just stopped. Marker hovering, eyes on the board but not seeing it anymore. "They're going to push back on Section 4, she said. But her voice had lost its executive precision. It was quieter, more unguarded. "They push back on everything," I said. "That's what boards do. Not like this." She lowered the marker. Callaway has been looking for a structural reason to recommend an external director for 18 months. This acquisition is the largest move this company has made in a decade. She paused. If anything reads as uncertain, if I walk into that room and give them one moment of doubt. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I set down my pen. Can I say something that isn't strictly professional? I asked. She turned to look at me. Cautious. Measured. Carefully, she said. You are the most prepared person in any room you walk into, I said. I've watched you for 18 months. I've seen you field ambush questions, redirect hostile conversations, and dismantle bad arguments so efficiently that the person making them doesn't even realize what happened until they're already agreeing with you. I held her gaze. Callaway doesn't have a structural argument. He has an ego problem. And ego problems don't win boardrooms. Preparation does. The silence that followed was long enough to make me wonder if I had miscalculated. Then, quietly, you've been watching me for 18 months? And there it was. The shift. That precise moment when the conversation stepped sideways from professional into something warmer and considerably more dangerous. Professionally, I said. Of course, she said, straight-faced. Purely analytically, naturally. I was taking notes. On what, exactly? I smiled. Your management style. She held my gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, then turned back to the whiteboard with the deliberate composure of a woman who had just won a small, unspoken exchange and knew it perfectly well. But then she said something that I wasn't prepared for. It's lonely, she said quietly, still facing the board, leading something this size. Everyone in that building sees the position before they see the person. A pause. Sometimes I think I've been performing competence for so long that I've forgotten what it feels like to simply. She stopped. Chose her next word carefully. Exist somewhere without an agenda attached to it. The honesty of it landed differently than anything she had ever said to me. I didn't fill the silence immediately. I let it hold her words for a moment, because she had offered them without armor and they deserved that much. You exist here, I said finally, quietly. Right now. No agenda. She turned to look at me. And for the first time since I had known her, since 18 months of clipped emails and boardroom precision, Barbara Ellison looked at me like I was something she hadn't expected to find. Then her phone buzzed on the table, a company-wide memo. Effective immediately. Professional conduct and workplace relationship policy. Renewed enforcement. The memo was 3 paragraphs long. I read it twice. Barbara read it once, which told me everything about how quickly her mind processed things she found threatening. She set her phone face down on the table with the careful, controlled placement of someone who wanted very much to throw it across the room. The silence between us recalibrated immediately. Whatever had been building in that conference room, that quiet, honest, slightly terrifying thing, retracted like a tide pulling back from shore, fast, instinctive, self-preserving. She picked up her marker and turned back to the whiteboard. Section 4, she said, back to precision, back to the executive frequency that kept everyone at a managed distance. Let's restructure the risk language. I looked at her for a moment, then I picked up my pen. Section 4, I agreed. The memo had been initiated by Richard Callaway. I didn't know that immediately, but the office has its own circulatory system, and information moves through it the way blood moves through a body. Quietly, efficiently, and eventually reaching everywhere. By Friday morning, the Whisper network had connected enough dots for the picture to become clear. Callaway was a senior executive vice president, 53, the kind of man who had built his entire professional identity on being the most important person in any room, an identity that Barbara's competence consistently, effortlessly dismantled, simply by existing. He had been angling for her position for the better part of 2 years. Not through superior performance, he didn't have that, but through politics, through optics, through the slow, patient construction of narratives. And now he had one. It started subtly, the way erosion starts, invisibly, until the ground gives way. A comment in the Monday briefing about maintaining professional culture during high-pressure project cycles. A pointed reference to appropriate boundaries between leadership and junior staff. Nothing direct enough to be challenged. Everything angled enough to be understood. I felt people watching me differently in the hallways. Not with hostility, with curiosity. The particular curiosity that attaches itself to someone who might be at the center of something interesting and professionally destructive. Margaret from legal had clearly not forgotten the hallway. Barbara's response was what I should have expected from her. She pulled back, not dramatically, not with a conversation or an explanation. Simply, the late night stopped, including the easy silences and the sideways smiles. The conference room became purely functional again. She addressed me in meetings with the same clipped, efficient precision she applied to everyone else on the team. Professional. Correct. Absolutely impenetrable. It was colder than her original indifference had ever been, because now I knew what existed underneath it. One afternoon I fell into step beside her in the corridor. Not intentionally, just the geometry of the building placing us in the same direction at the same time. She didn't break stride. "You've been avoiding me," I said, quietly enough that it didn't carry. "I've been managing a 9-figure acquisition," she said. "Barbara." She stopped walking. Looked at me with an expression that was controlled in the way that things are controlled when they require significant effort to hold in place. "David." Her voice was low, measured. "There are 12 cameras between this corridor and my office. Calloway has allies in this building who would very much enjoy watching me hand him a reason." She held my gaze steadily. "I have spent 11 years building something in this company. 11 years of being twice as prepared, twice as precise, and half as tolerated as the men at that table." A pause. "I will not watch it dismantle because I was careless." The word careless landed somewhere between us. I understood what she meant by it. I also understood that she didn't entirely mean it. "I'm not asking you to be careless," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, something unresolved and quietly aching. Then she walked away. And I stood in that corridor with 12 cameras, and the particular weight of wanting something you're not supposed to want. It happened on a Wednesday evening. The acquisition presentation was 48 hours away. The building was running on collective anxiety and recycled air, and Calloway had apparently decided that patience was no longer his preferred strategy. I was in the copy room, alone, running final presentation packets, when he appeared in the doorway. Expensive suit, measured smile, the kind of relaxed posture that belongs to someone who believes they've already won something. "David, isn't it?" he said, as though he didn't know precisely who I was. "That's right," I said. He stepped inside. Let the door close behind him with the casual deliberateness of a man who stages things. "Interesting position you've put yourself in," he said. "Close access to the executive director. Late nights, private conversations." He tilted his head. "How does that happen for a mid-level analyst?" I kept my expression neutral. "Hard work," I said. He smiled wider. "Of course." He picked up a paper from the counter, one of the presentation packets, glanced at it, set it back down. "Just be careful, son. Proximity to power is intoxicating. People make mistakes." A pause waited with intention. "Barbara has made enough of those for both of you, I think." He left. I stood very still in that copy room for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone. What I didn't know, what I only learned afterward, was that Calloway had gone directly from that conversation to the HR director with a formal observation report. Carefully worded, strategically vague, documenting repeated instances of unprofessional familiarity between Barbara and a junior team member during the acquisition project cycle. By Thursday morning, Barbara had been called into a meeting with HR and 2 board observers. I found out the way I found out most things in that building, through the circulatory system. Except this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was the look on Barbara's assistant's face when I arrived at the executive floor. A look that said something had already happened that couldn't be unhappened. I waited. At 6:15, she came out of the boardroom, alone, walking with the perfect posture and deliberate stride that I now understood was not confidence. It was armor. It was the walk of a woman who had learned that the moment you let them see you tired, they write a different story about you. She saw me in the corridor. She stopped. "Go home, David," she said. "No," I said. Something flickered across her face. Surprise. Then something more complicated. "This isn't a discussion. You defended me in there," I said. "I know you did. Because that's what you do. You protect everyone around you, and you absorb everything alone, and you call it professionalism." I took one step closer. "I'm not going home. You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand exactly what's at stake." My voice dropped. I understand that Callaway is threatened by you. I understand that 11 years of your work is sitting in that boardroom being evaluated by people who wouldn't last 6 months doing what you do. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I understand that you are standing here telling me to leave because protecting me feels more manageable to you than admitting that what's happening between us is real. The corridor was empty. The city hummed distantly beyond the glass. Her composure, that extraordinary, carefully constructed, years in the making composure, finally visibly fractured. David, her voice came out quieter than she intended, unguarded, raw. Barbara. I said her name the way I had been afraid to say it for weeks. Not as a title, not as a formality, as something that belonged to a person I genuinely, completely, irreversibly cared about. Her eyes searched mine, and then she stepped forward and kissed me. Not gently, not tentatively. The way someone kisses when they have been holding something back for long enough that the holding itself has become exhausting. With relief and conviction and the quiet devastation of finally stopping the fight against something true, when she pulled back, her forehead rested briefly against mine. This is going to complicate everything, she whispered. I pulled back just enough to look at her. Good, I said. The board meeting was at 9 o'clock Friday morning. Barbara walked in alone, which was what everyone expected. What nobody expected was what she placed on the table before Callaway could arrange his opening remarks into whatever carefully constructed narrative he had spent the week rehearsing. A documentation file. 14 months of compiled records, Callaway's pattern of strategic interference, misappropriated resources, and a specific instance of financial misrepresentation during the previous fiscal year's subsidiary review. Something Barbara had quietly, methodically documented with the particular patience of a woman who had always known this confrontation was coming and had simply been waiting for the right moment to have it mean something. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. By 10:40, Callaway had been escorted to a meeting with the company's legal counsel. By noon, the board had issued an internal statement regarding a leadership conduct review. By 2 o'clock, Barbara was back at her desk, reading glasses on, coffee in hand. As though the morning had been entirely unremarkable, I stood in her doorway. She looked up. You knew, I said. You had that file the entire time. I had the file, she said carefully. I was waiting for him to overreach far enough that using it would be unambiguous. You used me as bait. She set down her coffee. I used the situation, she said. There's a difference. A pause. You were never in any real danger, David. I looked at her for a long moment. That's the most Barbara Ellison sentence I have ever heard in my life. I said. The corner of her mouth moved. 2 weeks later, Barbara formally requested a structural amendment to the company's workplace relation policy. Specifically, a provision allowing disclosed relationships between employees of non-direct reporting hierarchies, subject to voluntary role reassignment where relevant. She presented it to the board with the same thorough, unassailable preparation she brought to everything. It passed. She told me afterward, in her office, with the city gold and sprawling behind her through the floor-to-ceiling glass. I've been amended out of it, she said. You'd need to transfer to the Meridian project team. Different reporting line. Different floor, I repeated. Third floor, she said. I'm on the 14th. That's 11 floors of professional distance. 11 floors, she agreed. Very appropriate. I crossed the room, stood in front of her desk, looked at her, this extraordinary, complicated, carefully constructed woman who had spent 11 years being twice as prepared and half as celebrated as she deserved, and felt something settle in my chest with the quiet permanence of something that had found its right place. Worth it, I said. She looked up at me. And this time she didn't contain the smile, she let it happen. 6 months later, the Meridian project team occupied the 3rd floor. Open plan, good light, excellent coffee machine. I had genuinely come to love it. Every morning at precisely 8:50, the elevator opened on our floor and Barbara walked through. Not to her office, which was 4 floors above us now, but to the small glass-walled meeting room we had unofficially designated as neutral territory. She brought the files. I brought the coffee. We worked for 40 minutes before the building properly woke up around us. It was our system. Unspoken, efficient, completely ours. One morning she arrived to find a single note on the table where her files usually sat. Careful, she picked it up. Read it. Set it down with the particular composure of a woman who is fighting a smile and losing gracefully. When I walked in with the coffee, she looked up. Say that again, she said. I set her cup down in front of her. Saturday across the table, looked at the woman who had rearranged something fundamental and permanent inside me, and smiled. Every day, I said, if you'll let me. She opened her file, but she was smiling, and the city outside the window was full of light. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, share it with someone who deserves to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, you already know what to do.